So an atheist scientist came running up excitedly to God and said, we did it, we figured out how to make a man without you. God just smiled and said, okay, show me how you do it. So the atheist scientist reached down and grabbed a handful of dirt, and God said, oh, no, you don't. Get your own dirt. So I thought that joke was just perfect after Mary's educational little piece on soil. That joke also reminds us that all of creation comes from God, even the dirt, and that we humans do indeed come from, and are made up of earthly elements. So as a result, we are fully dependent upon the land for our survival. And because of that, land has always played an outsized role throughout history and throughout the Bible. Wars have been and still are being fought over land. All you have to do is look at the situation in Ukraine. And biblical references to the land abound throughout the Bible. And like so many things in the Bible, that leads to a very complicated history. In the Old Testament, there are over 200 references to the land that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. The Jewish people considered the land to be a direct gift from God to God's chosen people. Remember the story about Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt to the Promised Land? Unfortunately, that has led to and is one of the stated reasons for the ongoing turmoil in Israel and Palestine. But believe me, friends, that's not the only reason for today's conflict. The first verse of the 24th Psalm beautifully highlights the importance of the land, and that the land ultimately belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and all who live in it. That sounds like a pretty straightforward reason to care for the land. But then we turn to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, for the passage that has been used and abused throughout history as a justification for abusing the land. God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Those two phrases, subdued and have dominion, which unfortunately are pretty good translations from the original Hebrew, have been used and abused throughout centuries for economic gain and as justification for destroying the delicate environmental balance that exists in nature. And friends, unfortunately, the church itself has a fraught history when it comes to land and land ownership. In 1493, just as European nations were beginning their push for exploration and colonization, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull entitled The Doctrine of Discovery, which stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered and claimed. European rulers jumped on this and used it as justification for colonialism and exploitation of indigenous peoples and natural resources across the globe. And that continued for centuries. U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall incorporated this papal bull into one of his rulings, stating that, quote, the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. And you know what that means. That effectively rejects any Native American rights to their ancestral lands. Not exactly a proud legacy of Christian history, is it? But the good news is, churches and others are finally addressing that legacy. In 2016, the ELCA Churchwide Assembly voted to become the second major Christian denomination to officially repudiate the doctrine of discovery in the name of the church. And other Christian denominations have followed. The land acknowledgement statement, which I read this morning, is an example of statements that organizations and even some corporations across the country are beginning to use to acknowledge and honor the original peoples that lived on this land. Many organizations feature their acknowledgement statements prominently on their website or in their printed materials. The president of Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago begins every public meeting by reading LSTC's land acknowledgement statement. And I believe I saw recently First Congregational Church in LaGrange, right across from the movie theater, has such a statement in front of the church. So keep an eye out for that. Our reading from the prophet Hosea this morning, while originally directed at the people of Israel who were falling away from God's covenant, it's equally applicable and directly to our times and our context with our own environmental problems and over our abuse of the land. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, and no knowledge of God in the land. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. Friends, the land is indeed mourning, and people are languishing, especially those living on the margins. For generations in this country, poorer people, and overwhelmingly they are people of color, have been most impacted by environmental injustices, or, a more accurate term, environmental racism. With little political or economic resources, they have no voice when major sources of pollution are built into their long-established neighborhoods. Just this month, this month's Christian Century magazine features an article about two women who have come to be known as the mothers of the environmental justice movement. One of the women, Hazel Johnson, was a resident of Altgeld Gardens housing project right here on the south side of Chicago. I'd like to share a part of that story from the magazine. Newly married in 1955, Hazel and her husband moved to Chicago and settled in the Altgeld Gardens housing project, a housing project that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development built in 1945 for Black World War II veterans because they were excluded from the mortgage benefits of the recently passed GI Bill. The foundations of Altgeld Gardens sat on a toxic waste dump from the bankrupt Pullman Rail Company. And not only built on poisonous land, Altgeld Gardens is surrounded by a polluted river to the south, a sewage treatment plant to the north, a highway to the east, and abandoned factories, hazardous waste sites, and landfills in every direction. And that's right in Chicago. Johnson coined the term toxic donut to describe the housing project, a label that sticks to that area even today. 7 years after moving into Altgeld Gardens, her husband was diagnosed with lung cancer at the age of 41. He died a few weeks later and was left to raise their 7 children alone. Over time, she came to discover that she was not alone in this experience. Countless other Black families in Altgeld Gardens and in similar neighborhoods around the country had similar stories. And instead of just accepting the status quo, Hazel got involved and worked for change through her church. And it was through that church's task force that she met a young man in his 20s who was also fighting for change, a young Barack Obama. As the article states, the two labored toward justice at her kitchen table. He was in his 20s, and she was in her 40s, but they learned off each other. And this was just the beginning of their work together, a legacy that President Obama brought with him into the White House as he continued to push for meaningful change in the fight for environmental justice. Friends, this story is but one example of how the church, in spite of, and now in many instances as a result of, its complicated history of exploiting the land and people, is taking the lead in pushing for meaningful environmental change. In 2015, Pope Francis released the encyclical Laudato Si on the care for our common home. I would strongly encourage each of you to read it. It's available as a free download on the internet, and it accurately captures the interconnectedness of how our poor treatment of the environment and unfair economic policies impact not just the most vulnerable, but ultimately all of us. It's an easy yet very impactful read. And after you read it, if you want to talk about it, come talk to me. I love talking about it. So there's your invitation. I'd like to share just a small portion of Pope Francis's introduction from Laudato Si, because I believe it perfectly captures our current situation with the earth that God created. Laudato Si, mi Signore. Praise be to you, my Lord. In the words of this beautiful canticle, St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth. This sister now cries out, however, because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the earth, and in all forms of life. That is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. Another important thing to remember, especially as Lutherans who hold the sacraments in high esteem, our sacramental elements come from the earth. Our water for baptism, grapes and grain for communion. Without clean soil, we couldn't even celebrate the sacraments. Cycling back to our reading from Hosea, the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. There is no knowledge of God in the land. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. The prophet Hosea is speaking directly to us today in the 21st century. He's issuing a warning. Friends, let's listen to that warning. Let's take action like people like Hazel Johnson, like Pope Francis is calling us to do, like countless others across the globe are doing. People are finally beginning to raise awareness. Friends, the consequences of our inaction are dire for all of us, but especially for those living on toxic land, drinking polluted water, or breathing hazardous air. But if we all follow our calling as Christians to care for the earth and all of God's children, the results, with God's help, are promising. We even hear that promise in the words of hope from the book of Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples. And God himself will be with them and be with be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things had passed away. People of grace, now is the time. It's our time. Let's work together to help create God's new earth for future generations. God formed us from the dust of the earth. We are a part of the earth. Let's ensure that all people, today and into the future, live on clean, unpolluted land. Let's finally stop the land from mourning. May it be so.